There are people who do not enter a room. They enter a field of signals. Before anyone has said anything important, something in them has already begun measuring the temperature. A pause that lasted half a second too long. A smile that arrived a little late. A voice that sounded normal on the surface, but underneath it, something tightened. Most people would call that intuition. Some would even call it a gift. But there is a point where awareness stops being wisdom and starts becoming captivity. Because when your mind has been trained to detect what others miss, you do not just notice life. You monitor it, you interpret it, you prepare for it. And after a while, you do not know whether you are living your life or standing guard outside it. This is the psychology of people who are too aware, not people who are simply intelligent, not people who are merely observant, but people whose nervous system learned often long ago that missing one signal could cost them peace. And that creates a painful paradox. The very thing that helped them survive can quietly become the thing that keeps them from ever feeling safe. William James once wrote that the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. But for some people, the problem begins earlier than thought. It begins in the body, in vigilance, in the old habit of scanning first and relaxing later. And if this is you, then you already know the strange loneliness of it. You can read a room before anyone names what is wrong. You can sense distance before it becomes visible. You can hear the shift in someone's tone that other people miss completely. And yet, for all this perception, you do not necessarily feel freer. You feel tired. Not because you are weak, not because you are dramatic, but because seeing too much is exhausting when you also feel responsible for what you see. That is where this story actually begins. Not with overthinking, but with a person who had to become mentally early to survive emotionally unstable ground. Some people are born more sensitive than average. Their system receives the world with the volume already turned up. They notice more, feel more, absorb more. But for many others, excessive awareness is not just temperament, it is adaptation. It is what happens when a human being grows up in an environment where safety was inconsistent, where love was present but unpredictable, where the emotional weather changed without warning. A child in that environment does not get to remain innocent for long. They begin studying the smallest clues, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the way a door closes, the energy in apparent silence, the difference between a normal evening and an evening that could turn. They become careful, not because they are naturally suspicious, but because their body learns that anticipation reduces damage. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And this is one of the most private examples of that truth. Because what begins as a survival pattern often becomes an identity. Years later, the person no longer says, "I learned to scan because I had to." They say, "This is just who I am." They think their vigilance is their personality. Their tension is their depth. Their inability to rest is proof that they are thoughtful. But often it is not depth alone. It is an old defense that has become so intimate it now feels like selfhood. And that is why people like this can be terribly hard on themselves. They ask, why can't I just let things go? Why do I always read into everything? Why can't I be normal around people? Why can't I just enjoy what is happening without mentally stepping outside it? But the more honest question is this. What if your mind is not malfunctioning? What if it is continuing a job it was assigned years ago? That changes everything. Because shame begins to loosen the moment you realize you're not broken. You are patterned. And once you understand that, you begin to see how this awareness shows up in adult life. It rarely arrives dramatically. It appears in ordinary moments. A short message from your boss that says, "Can we talk later?" For someone else, this is scheduling. For you, it is an opening in reality. 100 invisible possibilities rush in. Did I do something wrong? Was there something cold in that wording? Did I miss a signal yesterday? Why did the message feel so flat? And now the body's involved. Not later, now. Because awareness at this level is not passive. It is participatory. Your thoughts do not simply observe danger, they begin rehearsing it. Daniel Kahneman spent much of his work showing how fast and automatic the mind can be before conscious reasoning arrives. And in people who are hyper-aware, that speed often serves threat detection before it serves truth. The interpretation arrives first, the evidence arrives second. Sometimes it never arrives at all. So a silence becomes a message, a delay becomes a wound. A slight facial shift becomes a verdict. And this is where awareness becomes expensive. Because half of you is still in the room, answering, smiling, participating. But the other half is collecting data, cross-referencing memories, predicting outcomes, and preparing emotional defenses. That is not ordinary tiredness. That is cognitive overemployment. A hidden shift has started working a second job inside your mind. And the saddest part is that this same mechanism does not only point outward, eventually it turns inward. You do not merely feel things, you supervise yourself feeling them. A wave of sadness comes, and before it can even move through you, another voice appears. Why are you sad? This is ridiculous. You have things to be grateful for. What is wrong with you? Are you being ungrateful? Are you broken? Are you making this bigger than it is? So instead of experiencing emotion, you stand over it with a clipboard. Even joy is not spared. You'd laugh in a conversation, and a second later, part of your mind is already reviewing the performance. Was that too loud? Did that sound fake? Did I seem needy? Did they notice I was trying too hard? You are not only living the moment, you are also auditing it. And this creates one of the most painful forms of self-division. You become both the person in the experience and the observer evaluating the person in the experience. You are actor and audience, wound and witness, body and surveillance system. And what gets lost in that split is presence. You may still function beautifully. You may even seem composed, insightful, emotionally intelligent. But flow disappears when self-consciousness becomes constant. It is hard to dance when part of you is always standing outside the dance, taking notes. From there, something even more subtle begins to happen. You stop losing innocence in life. You start losing innocence in people. Not because you become cynical in a loud, bitter way, but because awareness teaches you that words are not always the whole event. A compliment can contain strategy, kindness can contain fear, affection can contain self-interest. An apology can be more about ending discomfort than telling the truth. And once you start seeing the backstage of human behavior, it becomes difficult to return to the stage and simply enjoy the scene. This is not hatred, it is caution, a very tired caution. You begin to hear subtext in ordinary conversations. You notice when warmth is slightly performative. You sense when someone is asking for closeness but protecting themselves with charm. You feel when a person's confidence is really a carefully dressed insecurity. And because you see the layers, you stop trusting the surface. That sounds like intelligence. Sometimes it is. But it also creates a profound form of relational loneliness. Because the world becomes harder to receive directly. You are not just speaking to people anymore. You are speaking to their defenses, their unmet needs, their fear of rejection, their need to be liked, their hidden resentment, their quiet hunger to be chosen. And while that may make you perceptive, it can also make intimacy heavy. You are no longer meeting a moment. You are meeting all the hidden machinery behind it. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our freedom and our power to choose our response. But for the overly aware person, that space often gets crowded. Crowded with interpretation, crowded with memory, crowded with all the previous moments that taught them to be careful. So, even when nothing openly harmful is happening, their inner world is rarely empty enough to rest. And eventually, that burden moves beyond thought and relationships. It enters empathy. This is where many deeply aware people become misread by others. They are often praised for being understanding, calming, emotionally mature, easy to talk to, and there is truth in that. But behind that gift is often a nervous system that does not know how to let another person's emotional reality remain separate. They do not merely understand tension in a room, they absorb it. Someone nearby is anxious and their own chest tightens. A friend describes grief, and hours later the grief is still echoing in their body. An argument happens across the table, and they feel as if their own inner environment has been rearranged. This is why so many overly aware people become unofficial emotional regulators. They know how to soften a tone, how to phrase something carefully, how to keep a room from breaking apart, how to sense when another person needs reassurance before that person even asks. And because they can do this, they often keep doing it, until one day they are exhausted in a way that is difficult to explain. Because the exhaustion is not from one dramatic event, it is from years of invisible emotional labor, from always being the one who notices, the one who adjusts, the one who understands, the one who can feel what no one else is saying. And that creates a quiet tragedy. The person who most easily understands others often becomes the person least likely to be met at the same depth. So they carry a lot, and they carry it privately. But private burdens do not remain in the mind forever. Eventually, the body begins speaking. A faster heartbeat, a tight stomach, a strange rush in the chest. A sense that something is wrong, even when nothing outwardly is happening. This is one of the cruel loops of hyperawareness. The body produces a sensation. The mind interprets it as warning. The warning creates more sensation. And then the person becomes trapped in a system that keeps proving its own fear. A small physical change becomes evidence. Evidence becomes alarm. Alarm becomes more data. More data becomes more alarm. And now the body is no longer a place to live. It becomes a dashboard full of threat signals. Abraham Maslow once wrote that when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. For the hypervigilant mind, when the primary tool is scanning, almost everything begins to look like a signal. Not because everything is dangerous, but because the system has become overtrained in detection. And then comes the final transformation. Awareness stops being observation and becomes control. This is not the kind of control that dominates other people. It is quieter than that. It is the control of endless mental simulation. If I can predict it, maybe it won't destroy me. If I can see the ending early, maybe I can soften the fall. If I can analyze every variable, maybe I will never again be caught emotionally unprepared. So the mind begins running ahead of life. What if this goes wrong? What if they leave? What if I lose this? What if this calm is only temporary? What if I trust this and then regret it? What if I should prepare now for a disappointment that has not happened? And there it is, the hidden religion of the overly aware person. If I anticipate pain hard enough, perhaps pain will hurt less. But it does not work that way, because rehearsing an injury is still a way of living inside it. Joseph Campbell wrote that the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. But for people like this, the deeper fear is not always the cave. It is life without armor. It is the terrifying possibility of being present without pre-managing every outcome. And this is the real cost. Not simply anxiety, not simply overthinking, but estrangement from the present. In trying to avoid being blindsided by pain, they gradually stop fully arriving for joy. They study the relationship instead of inhabiting it. They analyze the conversation instead of entering it. They monitor the feeling instead of feeling it. They prepare for loss while life is still trying to offer them something beautiful. That is why awareness can become a prison. Not because perception is wrong, but because survival never learned when to put the weapon down. So what heals this? Not ignorance, not becoming numb, not forcing yourself to be less deep. The answer is more subtle than that. It begins when awareness is no longer used as a shield against life, but as a way of being gently inside it. That shift matters, because the goal is not to stop noticing. The goal is to stop carrying every signal as if it were your responsibility. This is where many people misunderstand healing. Healing is not the disappearance of sensitivity. It is the end of total identification with it. You still notice the room, but you no longer serve it. You still sense other people, but you no longer mistake their weather for your duty. You still see what is unsaid, but you stop treating every perception like a command. And that requires a new kind of internal permission. The permission to leave some things uninterpreted. To let a silence remain a silence instead of turning it into prophecy. To let a sensation pass through the body without immediately building a narrative around it. To let another person be complicated without making yourself their translator, rescuer, or emotional container. This is not coldness. It is differentiation. It is one of the deepest forms of maturity. Carl Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that becomes impossible when your entire identity is organized around prediction. At some point, the overly aware person must ask a new question. Not, what am I sensing? They have asked that their whole life. The deeper question is, what am I allowed to release? That question changes the nervous system, because peace does not always come from better interpretation. Sometimes it comes from ending the compulsion to interpret. Not every delayed message is rejection. Not every bodily sensation is danger. Not every insight requires action. Not every discomfort is a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes you are simply tired. Sometimes they are simply distracted. Sometimes the room is heavy, and it does not belong to you. Sometimes your gift is not to decode reality more aggressively, but to remain human inside it. That is when awareness begins to mature. It becomes less like a blade and more like a lamp, still illuminating, still precise, but no longer violent toward its owner. And perhaps that is the real transformation. Not going from deep to shallow, not going from sensitive to numb, but going from guarded to grounded, from prediction to presence, from absorption to discernment, from I must understand everything to be safe, to I can notice deeply without abandoning myself. That is a different kind of intelligence. A gentler one, a freer one. And when that shift begins, life does not suddenly become simple. People are still layered. Relationships are still uncertain. The body still moves through stress. The world is still full of contradiction, but something inside you stops volunteering to carry all of it. You stop treating every room like a test, every silence like a warning, every emotion like a problem to solve, every insight like an emergency. You begin very slowly to return to the moment, to the body, to your own life. And maybe that is the line that matters most. You were never too much. You were never defective. You were never failing at being normal. You were trying to stay safe with a mind that learned too early that safety had to be earned through vigilance. So, if you have recognized yourself here, do not call yourself broken. Call yourself adapted. And then ask whether the adaptation has become too expensive. Because there comes a point when the old brilliance of survival must soften into something else. Something warmer, something more merciful, not less aware. Just less imprisoned by awareness. The deepest people are not always the ones who can see the most. Sometimes they are the ones who finally learn that seeing everything is not the same as carrying everything. And if that lesson reaches you at the right moment, it does not feel like motivation. It feels like exhale. Like setting down a weight you did not realize you had been holding in your shoulders, your chest, your thoughts, your relationships, your sleep. Maybe that is what real healing sounds like for a person like this. Not louder confidence, not perfect calm. Just a quieter sentence inside the mind. I can notice and still rest. I can feel and still remain myself. I can see deeply and still live.